As we've been reporting, the war in Ukraine appears to be losing the favor of many of the participants on the U.S. side. This fact has even begun to percolate through the U.S. media. And for more on that, we're going to go to Moscow and speak with analyst Mark Sleboda. Mark, it's a pleasure to have you with us as always.
Don, thanks for having me.
Why don't you fill us in on this?
Okay, so I want to talk about two articles that have emerged in the past few weeks in the New York Times. And the New York Times is what it is, right? It is a paper of record in the United States other than the Washington Post. And, when it comes to international relations, foreign policy, and military things, especially anything to do with the intelligence agencies, it's a group of stenographers who tell you what the anonymous officials at the Biden administration or intelligence or the Pentagon want you to think. And it's sometimes useful in that regard. But occasionally some actual facts leak through, usually belatedly, that usually aren't allowed to change the narrative, but of the things, specifically here, the conflict in Ukraine, but international politics in general, but are good confirmation, I think, of positions that you might have long held. When you finally see the numbers, the facts appear in the New York Times, even if they don't change the overall narrative, I think it's a degree of vindication. Yeah. And we all know, we've been told now for a year and 9 months. We're on a year and 9 months since Russia's intervention in the Ukrainian civil conflict, the SMO, Special Military Operation, or as the Western media likes to call it, Putin's invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah, you left out unprovoked.
Unprovoked. Yeah, sorry. Putin's unprovoked. Yeah. Okay, so the proxy war between NATO and Russia. Right. We've been told that Russia's running out of everything, right? Mm-hmm. All during the conflict, right? Lots of other things like the ruble is crashing and all this other stuff, which the Russian economy, all of it has proved nonsense and has been pulled back eventually. But this Russia's running out of military equipment, particularly missiles, has been kind of a constant harping. We've heard this every month since before Russia intervened about Russian missiles. So, and finally, the New York Times came out with an article on September 13th. Russia overcomes sanctions to expand missile production, officials say. The subtitle, Moscow's missile production now exceeds pre-war levels, right? Despite sanctions, supposedly crippling sanctions, officials say, leaving Ukraine especially vulnerable this coming winter. And then the beginning is Russia has managed to overcome sanctions and export controls imposed by the West to expand its missile production beyond pre-war levels. We're talking here the Caliber cruise missiles, the KH-101, Iskanders, right? Air defense missiles, of which Russia has been using a lot to knock down drones and cruise missiles supplied, NATO drones and cruise missiles supplied to their proxies in the Kiev regime. But a lot of missiles, right? And Russia doesn't seem to have any shortage of them. And finally, they're admitting because, Russia is getting all it needs either through domestic production or through countries, everything from Armenia and Turkey to the UAE, a lot of countries that are not, are often seen as aligned with the U.S. generally, but either their governments or just companies within the country are all too happy to middleman products on for a small
fee.
Profit. Yeah, small profit. Yeah. So it talks, of course, about the missile production, and largely they say the missile production has doubled. I would say it's probably more than that, but okay, let's go with that. Pre-war production has doubled, but more than that, they also talk artillery shells, which is really, they talk tanks, right? How Russia's production of tanks has doubled, and they're way cutting short there because they're only talking about the newest, most modern tanks, not older tanks that are upgraded to modern levels, which is actually, something that the U.S. and the West does all the time, and has done with tanks it has provided to Ukraine. But artillery shells is really important because we're all told this is a war of attrition, right? A war of industrial economic scale between Russia and NATO, because that's who's supplying it, right? And it has recently been admitted that, again, we were told many times that Russia's running out of artillery shells. It's NATO that ran out of artillery shells. And we were told how drastic that is. All of NATO ran out of artillery shells. They can't ramp up artillery shell production in the West fast enough because their military industrial complex has been tailored towards counterinsurgency warfare across the Middle East for their wars for hegemony there, and high-end boondoggles like the F-35 and the littoral combat ship and everything for decades now. And artillery shells aren't fancy. They're not extremely profitable. So they really dialed back production of these things. The U.S. doesn't fight war with artillery shells, right? The U.S. fights war with air superiority. Well, that's not something they can easily transfer to the Kiev regime. And this is a war of attrition, fought largely with artillery, with at times 70-90% of Ukrainian casualties coming from artillery or shrapnel from artillery.
Right.
So Russia is fired 10 million rounds of artillery last year, according to the New York Times, right? And they're on a lot of that, of course, comes from very large Soviet stockpiles, right? But they've also vastly increased their artillery shell production. And they say they're on a pace to produce 2 million artillery shells this year. Again, it's probably significantly higher than that. But what's more important is that artillery shell production, they say, is, according to the New York Times, right? Not me. 7 times what all of NATO produces together, and still several times what NATO might be able to produce together after 2 or 3 more years of planned increase of production, opening new factories, and the like. That is extremely significant, right? Because we are told that this is going to be a long war now. Jens Stoltenberg, the chance of any quick victory for Kiev and Russia giving up is gone. It's going to last for a long time, and it is a war of attrition. And artillery shells, industrial production matters. So that's something that has come out. It's been admitted, but it's not allowed to change the narrative. And NATO has exhausted their own potential. They've exhausted South Korea and Japan. Russia, to counter that, has turned to North Korea, who now it appears is going to be providing munitions for artillery and possibly rocket systems to Russia. And the Biden administration is so desperate, they've sent cluster munitions to Ukraine because these type are in a 155 millimeter artillery shell jacket. And even if they're not always the most appropriate thing for the job, it's better than shooting stones in their artillery howitzer, right? So that's how desperate it's gotten. And I think that talks volumes about the course of this long conflict. The White House press spokeswoman just came out yesterday, and this Karine Jean-Pierre, and she had a message to Putin that Biden says the U.S. will not let Russia outlast NATO in this conflict. Well, tell me how you're going to manage that with artillery shells. Just another small note. Last week, September 28th, who's gaining ground in Ukraine? This year, no one. right? Despite the Kiev regime's big offensive, right? So until you read deep in the article and you find that in the last year, despite the NATO-backed Kiev regime's offensive, with everything NATO could possibly transfer to the Kiev regime, arms, training, intelligence, planning, everything. Actually, Russia in the last year has gained 200 square miles of territory, and they're not even fighting a war of territorial, conquest. As the article expert points out, they're fighting a grinding war of attrition to destroy the Kiev regime's military. They don't necessarily want territory in Ukraine, and certainly not outside of the Donbass.
Right. So, there's two things that are interesting. First of all, the idea of Biden sending a message that he's going to outlast anybody is facially absurd. But I don't even know if he has already done that. But the other is that this sort of changes. I don't know if it changes it, but it certainly makes clear the strategic situation here.
Yes.
Because, first of all, in terms of being able to conduct a war of attrition, with all of the things you just named, no one has yet calculated China's entry into this war and their factories being applied to solving the problem of the war, and which is a tremendous additional, potential capacity.
Sure, I don't think it's necessary yet, but
I understand that.
It would certainly be game over. I mean, there's no
so taking that out, I just wanted to note that because that lies there also as dormant potential if that's what's necessary. Yes. No matter how Europe and America and Japan and Korea and Australia and anybody else scales up. The other thing, though, is just in terms of the strategic situation, if a war of attrition is not possible, then you either have to escalate to another level where it's something else. And you mentioned the air war basically is where this would have to take place. And what you're talking about when you talk about an air war is not for control of the skies over Ukraine, but rather an air war conducted into Russia and over Russia, which means it really a major war.
You couldn't do one without the other, right? You couldn't conduct an air campaign over Ukraine without going to air war with all of the Russian Air Force and all of Russia's very, very formidable air defense and electronic warfare.
Right. That's right. So I mean, that's where we're at. All right, Mark, thank you so much for your time as always, and we'll speak with you again next week.
Thanks for having me.
For KPFK, I'm Don DeBar.